Om Sthapakaya ca dharmasya Sarvadharmasvarupine Sthapakaya ca dharmasya Sarvadharmasvarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishna Te Namah Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Mritagamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Let us bow down to Sri Ramakrishna, the embodiment of all religions, the Supreme God incarnate. Let us pray to Him to lead us from unreal to the real, to lead us from darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge, to lead us from death to immortality. Today's topic, bliss, our real nature. It has been expressed very clearly in our scriptures that each one is the embodiment of bliss. Chidananda Rupaha Shivoham Shivoham. Everyone is Chidananda Rupa, the embodiment of knowledge, the embodiment of bliss. Each one has that blissful nature. So we see in this world, everyone consciously or unconsciously seeking joy. We are all living to experience joy, not to be miserable, but to enjoy happiness. We can get happiness only when we get rid of our ignorance about the things. So, seeking happiness is one of the most fundamental urges in all human beings. Everyone is incessantly engaged in various types of activities. In every action, each one has a motive behind it. Even though he may not always be conscious of his intention. There is a Sanskrit verse which says, Prayojana manuddishya na mandopi pravartate. Vedanta says that the motive behind all actions is what? Is nothing but the pursuit of happiness. It includes all forms of positive experience, from the sense pleasure to the highest bliss of Brahman. There is famous Upanishad, Taittiriya Upanishad. It deals with this subject matter of bliss very clearly. It identifies the highest reality with bliss. Everyone thinks Sukham me bhuyat, Dukkham me ma bhuyat. That means, may I get happiness, may I not get sorrow. Human life is more or less a constant quest for happiness of some sort or other. Because his very nature is bliss. He wants to reach that state of blissful nature. So he is in pursuit of this Ananda in so many ways. But paradoxically, happiness seems to be always eluding our grasp. Swami Vivekananda, in one of his lectures, Steps to Realization, he tells about this. He compares man's search for happiness to the oilman's bullocks going round and round the press in the hope of getting the wisp of straw tied to the yoke just in front of their eyes. We want boundless, we want endless happiness. But we may want it, but our efforts in this direction are checked by certain natural factors. Ignorance of the workings of one's own mind is one of the factors. Ignorance about the future is another. A second check is powerlessness. That is, the inherent limitations of the body, of the senses, and of the mind. Then there is a third check, the scarcity of objects of enjoyment. Owing to these number of obstacles, we can't fulfill our desires for enjoyment. Because we can't fulfill our desires, we come to suffering. In order to free himself from sorrow, one at first seeks worldly means. he finds that these are inadequate. So he turns to supernatural means and seeks the help of a personal God. This problem of sorrow has been seriously thought of by the sages. They were very much concerned about this problem, so they began to probe into the mystery of life and the true nature of the self. Through deep contemplation and direct experience, these sages have discovered some truths, very important truths about existence, about consciousness, and about happiness. And they have declared these experiences in the Upanishads. So the Upanishads are the great treasure. If you want to enjoy bliss, study Upanishads, assimilate the ideas, practice them. That's the way of assimilation. Then you will see how wonderful it is. It's already there. The bliss is already there. As I said earlier, Chidananda Rupaha, Shivoham, Shivoham. Each one is that, the embodiment of bliss. So, we are just discovering it. We are just discovering it. Once we reach that highest state, we will be enjoying the supreme bliss. As I said, the sages have discovered some important truths. The first one is all beings exist at different levels of consciousness, and for every level of consciousness there is a definite and fixed degree of happiness. This is a very important statement which you should all remember. Lord Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Ishvara sarva bhutanam hriddeshe arjuna tishtati brahmayan sarva bhutani yantra rudhani mayaya. Seated in the hearts of all beings, the Lord, by His Maya, makes them revolve as though mounted on a machine. As planets move around the sun, or as electrons whirl around the central nucleus in an atom, all the beings, they are revolving around a particular divine center called God. God is the divine center. We are all revolving around it. According to the theory of rebirth, life and death alternate with each other in countless cycles. What we call life is only half the cycle of our total existence, the other half being constituted by our post-mortem existence, of which we know very, very little. Let us take an example. When we speak of a river, what do we mean by that? We mean only the water course that is visible to us. But there is an unseen river formed of water vapor, which the sun and the wind carry from the ocean back to the mountain tops. Life, like the stream, consists of visible and invisible movements going on in cycles, impelled by the inexhaustive power radiating from the divine center, which keeps up its beginningless rhythm. The Untitled Upanishad describes human personality as constituted of 5 sheets, chambers or sheets. In Sanskrit it is called kosha. You are all familiar with this. There are 5 sheets inside which the Atman dwells. The 5 sheets are Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya Kosha, Anandamaya Kosha. Kosha means sheet. These 5 sheets are, the first one is physical sheet, the gross form which everyone is seeing. The second one, vital sheet. The third one, mental sheet. The fourth one, the sheet of intuition or higher consciousness. And the last one is the subject matter of today, the sheath of bliss. Sheath of bliss. So in order to discover your real nature of bliss, you should straight go into the last chamber, Anandamaya Kosha. When you reach that state, you will be in Samadhi. You don't like to come back anymore. You don't taste anything else afterwards. Vedanta says that the ultimate reality or Brahman is of the nature of Satchidananda. Absolute existence, consciousness, bliss. The self of each individual is called as Atman. This Atman is identical with the Paramatman, the Supreme Consciousness. Each sheath, which I referred to just now, represents a plane of existence and consciousness through which the supreme bliss of Brahman filters down, giving rise to the joy of experience appropriate to each sheath. I consciousness may get identified with any of these sheaths, and it is this identification that determines a person's character and a person's temperament. That determines his state of happiness in that particular sheath. When a person who is totally identified with the worldly affairs, the I consciousness is wholly identified with the gross body, what is called Annamaya Kosha, which is dependent on food, which is also called physical sheath. And it is identified with the vital sheath. And his happiness is only sense pleasure, derived from contact of the senses with the external objects. Coming to the intellectual sheath, in the intellectual person, the I is mostly identified with the mental sheath, though once in a while he slips down to the lower planes. Spiritual life begins only when one consciously tries to shift one's center of consciousness, or I, to the level of higher consciousness. The experiences of each sheath are not lost, but are recorded in it. How? In the form of latent impressions, what we call samskaras. Since we find a great variety in human temperaments and a corresponding variation in personal experiences, we may regard each sheath as consisting of several sub-levels or layers. It is owing to the multiplicity of levels of consciousness that human life appears so complex. And each individual seems to live in several worlds within worlds. Again, I am taking Untitled Upanishad. It also speaks about 5 levels of cosmic existence, corresponding to the 5 main individual sheaths. For the macrocosm and the microcosm are built on the same pattern according to Vedanta. Each of these cosmic levels may be looked upon as a kind of vast invisible orbit around the cosmic divine center, along which each individual soul moves, encountering different objects and getting different types of personal experience. Corresponding to the subdivisions of the sheaths, each orbit may also be thought of as having several suborbits. There is a definite degree of joy also associated with each level and sub-level. The second point is, which the sages have discovered, is that the degree of happiness associated with each level or sub-level He is independent of external events. This means that as long as a person remains at a certain level of consciousness, he can get only the degree of happiness natural to that particular level, whatever be the type of work he does or the circumstance he is in. The nature of the objects he encounters, that may vary, and so also his experience. But the degree of happiness he gets remains the same at that particular level of consciousness. Let us take an example. There is a hungry man. He fills his belly with an Indian meal, vegetarian food, and whatever that is natural for Indians. He gets happiness resulting from the appeasement of hunger. He is satisfied, he got happiness. There is another person who is also hungry. He turns to Western style of food. He takes the food and he also is satisfied by the food. There is a third person who prefers Chinese preparation of food. But the degree of happiness resulting from the appeasement of hunger is the same in each one. That's the point which you should all remember. The universe we live in is complex. It is full of discontinuities and mysterious physical constants. Many of them have been discovered by modern science. For example, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, which remains constant however much be the quantity of heat supplied. The movement of electrons within an atom are restricted to certain shells, each with a definite quantum number. The inner world of man is also full of discontinuities and constants, with the all-pervading Brahman as the only continuous and unchanging substratum. One such inner constant is the degree of happiness associated with each level or sub-level of consciousness. As long as we remain at a particular level of consciousness, we can get only its specific degree of happiness, and we can't increase this by any external means. We usually think that our happiness depends upon the type of work we do or the amount of wealth we have. But this is a great delusion which we all cherish. Can we say that the happiness of a doctor who handles blood and pus is greater than the happiness of a farmer who plows the land? Can we say that a businessman who rushes here and there with his briefcase is happier than an elementary school teacher? Whether we are doctors, engineers, desk clerks, or farmers, or students, as long as we all remain at particular level of consciousness, we can get only the same degree of happiness, whatever be the type of work we do. This important principle is the basis of Karma Yoga. That is the secret of Karma Yoga. Work does not create happiness. It only brings out the happiness that is already within. But the degree of happiness thus roused has nothing to do with the type of work we do. Understanding this truth, we stop grumbling about our work. Each work is great. We stop complaining about others. Jealousy vanishes from our minds, and we get mental peace. Realization of this truth will make a student a better student. He will no longer study only to pass his exam. He no longer studies only to secure a job, but also for the joy of knowledge. Joy of knowledge. It will make a doctor, an engineer, a businessman do his work not only for the sake of earning money, but also for the joy of doing it. Again, in his lectures on Karma Yoga, Swami Vivekananda says, each is great in his own place. This principle can be understood very well in the light of the second point, which I had just mentioned, that the degree of happiness associated with each level or sub-level is independent of external events. Coming to the third point, effort is needed only to remove the obstacles to happiness. If our happiness is independent of external events, as mentioned in the second point, then it is clear that by sitting quietly in one place without doing any work, one can get all the happiness that work is supposed to give. Indeed, this principle is a foundation of contemplative life. But then, what part does action play in our lives? Where is the need to do work at all? The answer is, in the first place, work is necessary to remove the obstacles to happiness. A well or a river may be a constant source of water, but in order to get the water, we have to dip a bucket into it. This effort in itself does not produce water, but is necessary to overcome the obstacle of gravity. Obstacle of gravity. So you get water in the bucket. Similarly, there is a perennial flow of joy in the depths of our being, but we have to put forth effort in order to overcome the obstacles that stand in our way of getting it. Work is needed only to remove the obstacles to happiness. But how many people really do work with this idea? On the contrary, by doing work ignorantly, by doing work carelessly, we only create more obstacles, and our work often leads to frustration. Instead of getting happiness, you get the opposite effect. But when we understand that the true purpose of work is to help the unfoldment of inner happiness, By removing the obstacles to it, our whole attitude towards work will change, and we will look upon it as an important aid to spiritual progress. What are these obstacles to happiness that work is expected to remove? There are many. Mostly wrong emotional drives like greed, hatred, jealousy, vanity, and so on. All these, they stem from one basic defect. What is that? Egoism or selfishness. Selfishness. That is the cause of all misery, all suffering, all sorrow. It is a veil that lies thick upon the soul, and unless it is at least partially lifted up, one cannot discover the true happiness that lies beneath it. The veil must be removed, must be lifted up. The best way to destroy all selfishness is to work for others. Work for others. Work is necessary to break the prison walls existing around the self and liberate the dammed up bliss within. Secondly, there is a creative urge in all of us, and work is necessarily for its expression. Cosmic energy is flowing in and through us, rousing our samskaras, latent impressions of past actions and experiences, and these force us to do work. The cosmic impulsiveness cannot be stopped. It must be directed into right channels through creative work. So, work is thus a constitutional necessity. A man can live without any work only when he is totally free from selfishness and has succeeded in directing the cosmic impulsiveness into higher spiritual channels constantly. Such a person alone can live an exclusively contemplative life. A person who can sit for 9 to 10 hours in meditation, he only can experience that state. The fourth point is, there is an urge in all human beings to seek higher forms of happiness. Shankaracharya says in his commentary on the Katha Upanishad, Sarvo hi uparyuparyeva bubhushati lokaha. Everyone aspires for the higher and the still higher. So there is an urge in man to go up from a lower state of existence to a higher state. And the motive power supporting this urge is man's thirst for higher forms of happiness. This urge is clearly manifest in spiritual people. But even in other people, it exists in a rudimentary form. It is eclipsed or swayed by baser passions. In every human being, there is an urge to seek higher forms of happiness, which finds expression in the pursuit of truth, in the pursuit of goodness, in the pursuit of beauty, and finally in mukti or liberation. known as value fulfillment or search for meaning, this universal urge lies at the foundation of philosophy, social service, art and religion. It is this undeniable psychosocial evolutionary urge that distinguishes man from animals. It is this urge to transcend the limitations of biological existence and even the limitations of rational mind that Swami Vivekananda defined as religion. Everyone, according to Swami Vivekananda, is potentially divine. That is, in each soul lies involved the capacity and urge to attain spiritual illumination and the supreme happiness that results from it. Man has a hierarchy of needs, and correspondingly there exist different types of happiness. The scriptures classify happiness into 4 main grades. The first one, that's the lowest one, is called Vishya Sukha, pleasure or happiness derived through the senses. This is invariably a discontinuous experience. Any sense experience pushed beyond a certain limit leads to revulsion. It is in order to overcome this inherent defect that man constantly seeks diversity in sense experience. The second type of happiness, higher than the previous one, is Shamasuka, meaning the joy of self-control. It is not the result of the activity of the senses and does not depend upon external object and is therefore continuous and long-lasting. When through long practice the senses are brought under control, one experiences great peace, a kind of pure joy that is undisturbed by the vagaries of mind and the changes of external objects. Devotion to God turns the mind away from the attraction of sense objects, and so the joy that a devotee feels in worshipping the Lord, which Sri Ramakrishna called Bhajanananda, the joy that one derives through worship, may also be classified under this category. Higher than this joy that is derived from the self-control, there's another type of happiness. It's called Atma Sukha, the pure joy of the higher self in its natural state. It can't be obtained merely by leading a moral life or by conventional devotional exercises. It is the result of a real spiritual awakening and is the first genuine spiritual experience that a sincere aspirant gets. Perhaps after years of intense struggles, it directly perceives the pure radiance of the self in the depths of the heart, and this detaches him forever from the illusory joys of the senses. When he experiences that Atma Sukha, it brings a sense of great fulfillment to the soul. But the scriptures speak of a still higher degree of happiness. That is still higher than this Atma Sukha. Still higher? What is that? It's called Brahmananda. It is a result of communion with God. Communion with God. That's called Brahmananda. The soul realizes the infinite ultimate reality and experiences boundless bliss. Man's insatiable and seemingly endless quest for happiness ends only when he begins to experience this measureless and everlasting bliss. There is another Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad. It says, that which is infinite, Bhuma it's called, that which is infinite is alone true happiness. There is no happiness in anything finite. And until man experiences this supreme bliss, he can never remain satisfied in life. Coming to the last point, in order to get higher degrees of happiness, one has to bring about corresponding changes in one's consciousness. We have seen that according to the first point which I mentioned a while ago, each level consciousness has its own degree of happiness. And that according to the second point, this is the independent of external events. Now the last point says that higher forms of happiness, that is different grades of spiritual bliss, cannot be obtained all on a sudden. You can't get that supreme joy by quantum jumps, but only by bringing about a transformation of I consciousness. Transformation of I consciousness. Our normal consciousness is limited by the sense-bound world. Ordinary senses cannot reveal any other state of human or divine existence. If we want to unravel the mysteries of higher planes of existence and the spiritual joys connected with them, the only way is to transform our chit, to transform our consciousness. Again coming to Taittiriya Upanishad, it speaks about the bliss of various classes of celestial beings. Don't think we are the only beings living in this universe. The universe is infinite. There are innumerable worlds. Innumerable beings are living in different ways. Now Taittiriya Upanishad describes this bliss in a wonderful way, taking as a unit of happiness of a young man endowed with health, wealth, ambition, learning, capacity. Such a person, the joy of this young man, if you take that as one unit, multiplied by 100 times, that becomes the joy of one particular species of beings. They are called Manushya Gandharva. Gandharva. They are celestial beings. There are two grades. One is called Manushya Gandharva and another one is called Deva Gandharva. So the joy of Manushya Gandharva is 100 times more than the joy of the young man, very healthy, wealthy person. So, this Manushya Gandharva, his joy is 100 times more than the previous one. Now multiply this by 100 times. Then it becomes a joy of one Deva Gandharva, another higher form of being. Higher still in the ascending order are the joys of mains, gods, Karma Devas, Indra, Brihaspati, Prajapati, and so on. Now the happiness of each of them being 100 times greater than that of the preceding one. The Upanishad further says that the happiness of all these celestial beings can be attained by a person in this world who is free from desires and is endowed with spiritual knowledge. In other words, by transforming his own consciousness, one can reach the status of each celestial being and experience the bliss of that being natural to his state. Each celestial being of the hierarchy mentioned represents a level of consciousness, and the joy associated with that level can be obtained only by attaining that consciousness. There is another Upanishad called Mandu Ke Upanishad. It describes the self of man as having 4 dimensions. The first dimension is called as Vaishvanara, that is the sense-bound ego which animates the gross physical body. Higher than this is called Taijasa, which dwelling in the sheath of intuition supports the subtle body. Higher still is the Prajna, which is identical with the causal body. In the last and highest dimension of the self, the distinction between the individual and the cosmic is lost. If we want higher forms of happiness, we must undergo progressive transformation of our I consciousness. In the lower dimensions of the self, existence, consciousness and happiness are seem to be separate categories. But as one's self-awareness undergoes transformation and expansion, one finds that the 3 categories meet, and at the highest dimension of the self finally merge into one undivided, infinite, ultimate reality known as Satchidananda, existence, consciousness and bliss absolute, in which one's I consciousness is lost. So we find that bliss is our inseparable aspect of our real nature. It is a natural state of our being. But then, masked by primordial ignorance, hemmed in by the limiting adjuncts of body, mind and the senses, we are separated from the boundless ocean of Sachidananda, of which we are parts. And this is the basic cause of our unhappiness, because of this separation. In course of time, we will realize that all life is one, and that existence is itself bliss. If you study Sri Ramakrishna's life, you find how he experienced this highest state of bliss by practicing non-dual methods. He found in the final analysis that everything is that supreme consciousness. In that state, he is immensely peaceful. He is immensely blissful. That is the state which we should reach upon. And everyone is struggling to get into that highest state of bliss. Till that state is reached, we have to keep on struggling and struggling, learning through suffering and becoming serious about efforts to get higher and higher type of joy. So spiritual life is the one that gives you the experience of this highest bliss, which is the real nature of every one of us. When you experience this highest bliss, there is no more coming down, there is no more sorrow at all, and one gets complete fulfillment, complete satisfaction. So let us try to practice and reach that highest state of bliss. Thank you all. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. May the Divine Lord protect us, nourish us. May we work in harmony with great vigor. May our study be illuminating and fruitful. May we love each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.